I attended the police academy at Indiana University. At the time, it was one of the only academies outside of the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy in Plainfield that the state officially recognized as a full police certification academy. The program itself was unique. While a full-time student with Indiana University, you had to apply for the IU Police Department. The application process was very similar to getting hired by a police department. If accepted, they put you through the complete Indiana Law Enforcement Academy over the summer while you were at IU. What really made the academy different was the way we were trained. Most police academies in America were, and still are, based on a military basic training model. Drill instructors screaming at recruits, constant stress, punishment, collective discipline. You know, a lot of bullshit. That wasn't us. We lived in our own apartments. We showed up for PT at 6 in the morning, then class at 8. We trained hard, studied hard, and we were treated like adults preparing for a profession instead of recruits surviving boot camp. And a lot of cops around the state used to joke about it. They called it the Country Club Academy. The implication was always the same, that somehow we had it easier. But over the years, I watched the people who came out of that academy go on to become outstanding police officers, investigators, supervisors, and leaders at all levels of policing, from local police chiefs to sheriffs to federal officers. And I started realizing something. Maybe treating recruits like professionals actually produced better professionals. Maybe teaching officers how to think was more valuable than teaching them how to endure screaming. Maybe our so-called country club was working a whole lot better than the boys' club. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. To understand why police academies in the United States look the way they do today, you have to go back to the early and mid-20th century. Because the modern American police academy didn't just appear out of nowhere. It evolved out of the culture and priorities of the era that created it. Before formal academies existed, policing in America was, honestly, pretty inconsistent. In many places, there were few standards at all. Officers were often hired based on political connections, local influence, or simply because somebody thought they looked tough enough to wear a badge. Training might last a few days, sometimes less. A lot of policing was learned through apprenticeship and experience rather than structured education. Then the United States entered a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization. Cities exploded in size. Organized crime grew during Prohibition. Labor unrest increased. Corruption inside police departments became a national issue. And by the 1920s and 30s, there was growing pressure to professionalize policing. This is where the military influence really begins to take hold. Reformers at the time looked at the military and saw structure, discipline, uniformity, chain of command. They believed policing needed the same thing. And to be fair, there was logic behind it. Police departments were trying to turn what had often been political street gangs with badges into organized professional institutions. They wanted officers who followed orders. They wanted standardized behavior. They wanted departments to look disciplined and publicly legitimate. Then, World War II accelerated everything. After the war, huge numbers of veterans entered law enforcement, and naturally, they brought military culture with them. Many police instructors had military backgrounds. Many chiefs had military backgrounds. Society itself viewed military structure as effective and honorable. So, police academies increasingly adopted the same framework. Drill instructors, formation marching, inspections, stress exposure, collective punishment, rigid hierarchy, and command obedience. And some of that absolutely worked. Police work can be dangerous. Officers do need discipline. They need emotional control under stress. They need to function when they're tired, scared, angry, or overwhelmed. Departments needed a way to prepare people for chaotic and sometimes violent situations. So the paramilitary academy model became dominant because it solved several problems at once. It created standardized training. It created organizational identity. It reinforced chain of command, and maybe, most importantly, it could produce large numbers of officers relatively quickly. That last part matters more than most people realize. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, America experienced enormous social upheaval. Rising violent crime, civil unrest, riots, political extremism, the drug war, gang violence. Police departments across the country needed manpower fast. The academy became less about higher education and more about rapidly preparing recruits to survive the street. And once a system becomes institutionalized, it tends to reproduce itself. Officers trained in paramilitary academies became instructors. Those instructors trained the next generation the same way they were trained. The culture reinforced itself decade after decade. That's important to understand because most police instructors genuinely believed they were preparing recruits for reality. In many cases, they were teaching them what had kept them alive. Now, here's where things start getting complicated because while policing evolved dramatically over the last 50 years, academy culture didn't. The modern police officer is expected to do far more than enforce laws. Officers deal with mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, constitutional law, child abuse, homelessness, suicide intervention, crisis negotiation, community relations, medical emergencies, trauma response. And they're expected to navigate all of it under constant public scrutiny. But many academies still fundamentally operate from a framework developed for a very different mission, maintaining order through discipline, command presence, and tactical readiness. And this is where the criticism of the paramilitary model really comes from. Critics argue that if the majority of modern policing involves communication, judgment, restraint, and problem solving, then an academy primarily built around stress compliance and rigid hierarchy may not be the best way to prepare officers. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean military-style training is worthless. Some parts are incredibly valuable. Physical fitness matters. Emotional resilience matters. Stress inoculation matters. Officers absolutely need to know how to function under pressure. The problem is balance, because when survival becomes the dominant lens of training, it can unintentionally shape how officers view the public. Recruits may begin to see every encounter primarily as a potential threat instead of a problem to solve. And over time, that mindset can affect everything from communication to use of force decisions. The other reason this model persists is honestly pretty simple. Changing police training in America is incredibly difficult. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. Different states, different laws, different budgets, different political cultures. Some departments barely have enough money to keep patrol cars running, let alone redesign entire training systems. And there's also cultural resistance. A lot of officers hear criticism of the academy model and immediately think people are attacking toughness itself. They hear, "You want softer cops." But that's not really the argument. The argument is that modern policing requires more than toughness alone. It requires intelligence, emotional control, communication, critical thinking, ethics, adaptability, and the ability to make lawful, measured decisions in complicated human situations. The reality is this: the paramilitary academy model became dominant because it fit the needs of its time. It brought structure to chaotic departments. It created standards. It prepared officers for dangerous work. And for decades, America doubled down on that model because crime, disorder, and social instability reinforced the belief that policing needed to be hard, aggressive, and survival-oriented. But the question facing modern policing now is whether a system designed primarily for the challenges of the 1950s through the 1980s is still the best way to prepare officers for the realities of 2026. The simple answer is no, it isn't.
The Legal Liability Risk Management Institute is the nation's largest provider of liability and risk management services in the United States. Our goal is to help reduce liability, reduce lawsuits, and enhance officer performance. Regardless of the size of your agency, we have a risk management solution. You may contact us at www.llrmi.com or call 317-386-8325.
What's interesting is that the United States almost went a very different direction with police training. Before World War II, there was actually a growing movement in American policing towards higher education and professional academic instruction. During the early 1900s, a lot of reformers believed policing needed to evolve into a true profession, not just a job, a profession, something closer to law, medicine, or engineering. Colleges and universities across the country began creating what were called police science programs: criminal law, sociology, psychology, public administration, criminology. The idea was that policing wasn't just about physical enforcement. It was about understanding society, human behavior, law, and governance. And if history had unfolded differently, there's a very real chance the United States might have adopted a much more education-centered policing model decades ago. But then World War II happened. Europe, however, continued moving in that direction. Now, before I go any further, let me be very clear. Policing in Europe is not identical to policing in the United States. The cultures are different, the legal systems are different, gun ownership is different, population density is different, crime patterns are different. And most importantly, many European countries operate under national or centralized policing systems rather than America's highly decentralized structure. Because of that, countries like Norway, Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands generally operate with far more standardized national training systems than the United States. And that matters because America has over 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies. 18,000. Tiny rural departments, sheriff's offices, big city agencies, state police, tribal police, university departments, transit police. It's an unbelievably fragmented system. Europe generally doesn't have that level of fragmentation, so no, you can't simply copy and paste the European system directly onto the United States. Anybody pretending otherwise isn't being serious. But with all those differences acknowledged, I still believe the European approach gets one major thing right. It treats policing as a profession, requiring extensive education. In many European countries, becoming a police officer takes years, not months, years. Officers spend extensive time studying law, ethics, psychology, communication, conflict resolution, report writing, constitutional principles, and scenario-based decision-making. Many programs resemble college degree programs rather than traditional boot camps. And importantly, the training is often integrated with supervised field experience over long periods of time. Recruits are not simply thrown onto the street after a compressed academy. They develop gradually under supervision while continuing formal education. That's huge because modern policing is incredibly complicated. Think about what we ask officers to do. We expect them to understand use of force law, constitutional law, crisis intervention, mental illness, trauma, de-escalation, domestic violence dynamics, addiction, child abuse, cultural issues, medical emergencies, evidence collection, and public communication. Then, we expect them to make split-second decisions while people film them from 6 different cell phones. That's not a skill set you master in 20 weeks. The European model fundamentally starts from a different assumption than the American paramilitary model. The assumption is this: a police officer is primarily a highly trained public professional who sometimes must use force, rather than a force-oriented professional who must occasionally solve social problems. That's a very different philosophical starting point. And philosophy matters because it shapes how officers see the public and how the public sees officers. Now, does that mean European policing has no problems? Of course not. Every system has problems. But overall, these systems generally produce officers who are better prepared academically, emotionally, and socially for the realities of modern policing. And one of the biggest reasons is time. Time matters. You cannot compress maturity. You cannot mass produce judgment. You cannot speed run emotional intelligence. The American system often tries to create fully functional officers in under a year because departments desperately need staffing. The European systems generally accept that developing a professional police officer is a long-term investment. And honestly, I think that investment shows. Because when you lengthen training, you gain something incredibly valuable: the ability to filter people out before they ever hit the street. Some recruits mature, some don't. Some can handle conflict appropriately, some can't. Some can communicate under pressure. Some absolutely should not have authority over other human beings. Extended training gives organizations time to identify the difference. The other thing these systems recognize is that policing is increasingly knowledge-based work. Yes, officers still need tactical skills. They absolutely do. But most police work today is communication, judgment, and problem solving. Most officers will go their entire careers without firing their weapon, but every single officer will spend thousands of hours talking to people in crisis. That requires education, not just conditioning. And this is where I think the United States needs to seriously rethink its approach. Not because Europe is perfect, not because America and Europe are identical, but because the modern demands of policing have outgrown the training model we inherited from the mid-20th century. The truth is, policing in America became increasingly militarized after World War II because the country believed it needed officers who could survive disorder and violence. Europe, in many ways, continued developing the earlier professional education models America had once started exploring before the war. And today, I think we're seeing the long-term results of those two very different philosophies.
When the shift gets long and the calls keep coming, the stress starts piling up. You need more than just background noise. You need the Thin Line Rock Station, real rock, real personalities, and a community that understands the job. Turn it up and ride with us. The Thin Line Rock Station, keeping those who serve connected one song at a time.
So, if we're serious about reforming police training in the United States, what would that actually look like? Here's my proposal. A complete overhaul of the academy system for every certified law enforcement officer in America. And before anybody panics, let me say this up front. This is not about taking control away from local agencies. Local policing matters. Rural Indiana is different from downtown Chicago. A university police department is different from a sheriff's office. Local agencies should absolutely maintain operational autonomy. But what we can no longer afford is wildly inconsistent foundational training standards. So, here's how I think the system should work. First, every currently certified police officer in the United States gets grandfathered in. Period. We are not firing half the country's police officers overnight. We are not pretending experienced officers suddenly don't know how to do their jobs. That's unrealistic and frankly disrespectful to the people already serving. This reform is about the future, about building the next generation better than the last. Phase 1 would be a 3-month boot camp style academy. And yes, I said boot camp style intentionally, because despite all the criticism I've given the military academy model, there are absolutely things it gets right. Physical fitness matters, discipline matters, stress inoculation matters. Officers need to learn how to function while exhausted, frustrated, overwhelmed, and under pressure. They need standards, they need accountability, and they need emotional control. And frankly, some recruits need to learn structure. So, the first 3 months should absolutely focus on physical conditioning, defensive tactics, firearms fundamentals, emergency driving, command structure, professionalism, discipline, and controlled stress exposure. But then, and this is the critical difference, the academy doesn't stop there. After that initial phase, recruits transition into 21 months of academic and professional instruction. Not weeks, not a few extra classes squeezed between range days. 21 months. At that point, the academy effectively becomes the equivalent of a specialized associate's degree in policing and police science. But here's the key. Officers can't simply transfer in generic college credits and skip the process. The education has to come through the academy itself. Why? Because policing is its own profession, and it deserves profession-specific education. That curriculum should include criminal law, constitutional law, psychology, sociology, ethics, report writing, crisis intervention, addiction studies, trauma response, de-escalation, communication, conflict resolution, cultural competency, investigations, leadership, evidence handling, and extensive scenario-based practical training. And importantly, this training would not replace tactical skills, it would integrate them. Officers would continue firearms training, defensive tactics, and scenario work throughout the entire program. The difference is they would also spend nearly 2 years learning how to think like professionals, because modern policing is not just physical work anymore. The days of being knuckle draggers are over. It is intellectual work, it is emotional work, it is legal work, it is social work under pressure. Then, after graduation, every officer would complete a mandatory 4-month field training program with the agency hiring them. And this is where local autonomy stays intact. The academy provides the foundation. The local agency teaches the recruit how that specific department operates. A deputy sheriff in rural America may handle very different calls than an officer in Los Angeles. A university officer deals with different challenges than a state trooper. Departments still need the ability to shape officers around their own communities and operational realities. So field training becomes the bridge between national professional standards and local policing culture. And honestly, I think that's the balance America needs. We don't federalize policing. We don't create a national police force. We preserve local control. But we establish a national expectation that every police officer in the United States receives a serious professional education before receiving full authority. Now, obviously, this would be expensive, extremely expensive, which is why funding should be shared. 1/3 federal funding, 1/3 state funding, 1/3 local funding. The federal government has an interest in constitutional policing and national professional standards. States already oversee certification systems. Local agencies directly benefit from better trained officers. Everybody has skin in the game, so everybody contributes. And these academies shouldn't stop at entry-level training. They should evolve into permanent professional education institutions for law enforcement. Offer bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees, advanced certifications, leadership programs, investigative specializations, executive development. Real higher education built specifically around policing and police science. Because one of the biggest mistakes American policing ever made was treating education as optional enrichment instead of foundational professional development. Doctors continue education, lawyers continue education, engineers continue education. Modern policing is too important and too complex to pretend officers stop learning after a 6-month academy. And yes, implementation would take years, maybe decades. There would be staffing shortages. There would be political fights. There would be resistance from agencies and unions and legislators. But if we genuinely want better policing outcomes in America, better officers, better decision-making, fewer unnecessary use of force, better communication, greater professionalism, and strong public trust, then training has to become the foundation, not a checkbox, a profession. And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.